Welcome everyone to the latest in our Sunset series here at Morecambe Bay Partnership. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Anna Gillespie tonight, who's going to be talking to us about how ship came to be at Half Moon Bay, Heysham, and it's amazing. I think it's exactly 2 years since it was unveiled as a sculpture or launched, maybe, if you don't mind the pun. As one of the climaxes to our Headlands to Headspace lottery-funded project that we led on a Morecambe Bay Partnership. And I think in those 2 years, it's definitely become quite a local cultural icon. We get loads and loads of comments about it. It's become a real fixture. And I think it's fair to say that people absolutely love it. We commissioned the work all those years ago, and Anna's joining us tonight to talk a little bit more about her creative journey. So we'll find out a little bit more about her background and her work as an artist. As well as ship, she has done some remarkable work elsewhere, including for Glastonbury Festival and the RHS Chelsea Flower Show. But it's ship, obviously, that we're proudest of here. That's the main focus of the talk tonight. So thank you very much for joining us. So I'm Tom Burdett. I've been chairing most of these talks, and I'm actually the chair of Morecambe Bay Partnership. Most of you know we're a small charity. We work all around the bay, from Barrow right the way down to Fleetwood, occasionally over into the Duddon estuary as well. And we work in lots of different areas. Whatever it is that makes the bay special, that's where we are. So whether it's arts or archaeology, birds, beach cleans, collecting memories and stories, opening up the countryside for disabled access, or creating the bay cycleway. Often it's Morecambe Bay Partnership that's at the heart of all of that. The Sunset series really, I think, is some of us at our best. So sharing the magic of Morecambe Bay, sharing the wealth of history, much of it not always appreciated, not much of it always understood, but I think these series have been a brilliant way of connecting with that and with each other. We are a charity, and you'll be aware, I think, that it's been a pretty tough year for charities. Many of us have really struggled for funding this year. So thank you, a massive thank you to all those of you who have been giving us donations to help to keep this series alive and thriving. And there will be a link again posted on the chat for any online donations that you feel able to make tonight. It just really helps us to keep putting on these talks. So just before I hand over to Anna, I'll just say a little bit about her. So Anna describes herself as a sculptor, or figurative sculptor, and interestingly, she comes from a family of artists. So both her parents were artists, and we were talking beforehand. She was absolutely convinced that she wanted to do what all artists do, which is rebel against their parents. Didn't want to get into art, and so decided to study philosophy and politics instead. But of course, your calling in life always tends to catch up with you, doesn't it? And by the age of 28, she realized that actually she wasn't cut out for a desk job, and went back to her original dream of sculpture and fine art. She studied as a stone mason as well, and I think that really comes across in some of her work, that lovely kind of chunkiness that there is. So she's now been working as a sculptor, it says here, for almost 30 years, which I can't make that maths work, Anna. You'll have to maybe talk to us about that. That can't be right.
Yes, no, it can't be.
No. But anyway, apparently you still consider that you're learning your trade. So yeah, over to you. Really, I'm particularly excited about this myself. So over to you, and welcome, and thank you so much for giving up your evening to talk to all of us.
Well, thank you, Tom. Well, first of all, it's just lovely to be here, and gosh, seeing all these faces, it's almost quite overwhelming because I can see all of you guys. But we'll move to the slides soon, and I think we've got them up now. I mean, first of all, I also just want to thank Morecambe Bay Partnership for inviting me to talk tonight. but of course, even more fundamentally for inviting me to make this sculpture. But I thought what we'd do first is I'm gonna sort of start with an early piece of sculpture, and this one is called Cracked, because some of these early sculptures I'm going to show you, you'll see later in a way how they came to play their part in Ship, because actually people often sort of say to me, well, how long did it take you to make that sculpture? And it's not like that, because all the sculptures connect and they all inform each other, and often I throw stuff away. So it's like a sort of continuous thread which runs across these 30 or 25 or whatever years it is, and you can't really separate the bits out. So when I started making sculpture most seriously was shortly after I had children. I'd taken an MA and done stonemasonry before, but bizarrely, it was having children that really, I suppose after that, I took every single hour of my day very seriously. And yes, I've also shown this image because I want to show you about diversity of materials. I do enjoy using different materials. And this little one is called Cracked, and it was really an accident. I couldn't get this head off its stand and had to sacrifice it, had to hit it with a hammer. And in hitting it with a hammer, of course, it became itself. It became much more what it is. There's also an element of melancholy in this sculpture. And I've introduced this particularly because I think there is something of that in Ship, which we can discuss later. But anyway, shall we have the next slide now, please? So again, you can see the theme of the children here. And after being a stonemason and realizing just how hard it was lugging even the smallest amount of stone around, I developed this method of making sculptures, which was I was using scrunched up masking tape. And the beauty of these figures, from my perspective, was twofold. A, I could lift them, and B, I could make them, and my hands were still clean. So the children could be playing Lego and I could be making these, and I could just break off and cook supper. It's a brilliant medium I recommend for any mothers. But I've always been interested in the figure, really. Every now and then I try and do an abstract sculpture, and this is no reflection on abstract sculpture, but it just doesn't do it for me in my making process. If I'm not struggling to make the human form, then I'm kind of not engaged, which is just personal. Okay, so the next slide, please. And this is another material again. This is in fact mud rock, which is what they'll put on your arm if you break it in hospital. But this piece, yes, as you can see, there's a sort of sadness to this piece. It's called Still Hurting. Yes, and again, it's the relationship between two figures, which is sometimes most interesting. Each one of these by themselves wouldn't speak as much. So we'll go on to the next one now. Okay, so what happened in 2004 is I had two small children, and I was merrily making sculptures and, you know, enjoying myself. And suddenly the true extent of the environmental crisis, of the climate emergency, struck me. It was a very hot summer and we moved to Bath, and I suddenly realized that, well, I had this profound question, which was making sculpture okay, given that as a species, we're really in a pretty dire state? So I took myself off to a course called Art in Place, which actually Anthony Gormley was teaching on, and also Peter Randall Page, who is a wonderful sculptor. And I wasn't the only person asking that question, which was a huge relief for a start. And I started realizing that perhaps the way forward was to make sculptures that try to draw attention to the beauty of the planet and to the beauty of nature, in the hope that maybe by sort of taking that beauty and then putting it in galleries, it was really a call to sort of let's honor the beauty and try and take care of our planet. So as a result of that, I spent about 8 years collecting tree materials and making sculptures such as this is called Taste the Rain. And it's made of bark, which I found from a fallen tree. So yes, so that's what he's doing, looking up to the heavens, really. And if we have the next slide. Sorry, who's on slides? Is it Susanna? Oh, there we go, lovely. So this little one, again, you see the child theme coming in. You can see the themes already, you'll see themes circulating. Can you see that that is made of acorn cups? So I spent many, many years, like 8 years or more, picking up acorn cups, and I got to know different oak trees around where I live extremely well. And each one of these sculptures is made from the acorn cups of just one tree. Because what you discover when you start becoming an acorn cup nerd, like I did, is that trees often have very different shaped acorn cups. Even something like that, nature exhibits its amazing diversity. And so, for example, some cups might be more purplish, some brown, some flatter, some almost conical. So each one, in a way, was a homage to a particular tree in a particular place. But the fundamental philosophy behind this was also that as humans, we're not separate from nature. So just as nature creates all these beautiful things, each acorn cup it's like the classic thing about a snowflake. Each one is basically the same, and yet each one is unique. You can't find two exactly the same. And that's like us humans. And it's not a coincidence. It was me trying to sort of press this philosophical point that we're not separate from nature, you know, we are very much part of it. I mean, it goes without saying in some ways, but sometimes I feel we think we're almost above it. Culturally, that can happen to us. So if we have the next slide now, please. Oh, and this is what my studio looked like at that time. All of these acorns. I mean, people used to say to me, can't you get your children to help you collect acorns? It's like, well, actually, no, because it's quite a concentrated job. You know, I was on my hands and knees for hours with the squirrels and the spiders, and then these acorns would come back, each tree separated, and I think you'll see some beech nuts in there as well. And they had to be turned and dried and then stored. And I still have some left, which is rather nice. So this is Glastonbury Festival, and I was just delighted to be asked to do this. And this is the entrance to the green fields, which is the area which is all about ecological issues and recycling and such. So they wanted me to use sort of recycled materials, and I sort of thought, well, can I use acorns? But this is made out of the wood chips from the local park that I went along with my plastic bag, and I thought, well, that's recycling. I mean, in a way, wood chips themselves are a recycling process, and then I went and upcycled them, I think is the term. And this sculpture was huge fun to put up, and the chap is looking at the main stage, the pyramid stage, which many of you will have heard of, and she's looking down. This is quite a high structure because the trucks that serviced the festival had to go underneath it. But yes, this is one of those sculptures where, like Ship actually, where the installing of it is part of the privilege and is just so memorable. Okay, so here we are. So this is another set of work I did. This is called Blown Away. And this is at RHS Chelsea with Chris Beardshaw, who was an incredible chap to work with. Basically, when I was 40, I went down to Tate St Ives. I don't know if any of you have been there, but it is the most glorious building, and was very inspired by David Nash's work, his drawings. And I started drawing. I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to sort of emulate him. And I'm going to draw one figure on one piece of paper every single day for 40 days. So I got 40 sheets of paper. I had the same materials, and I limited how many materials I had, you know, charcoal, pencil, and I think I had some red. And I'm just going to draw a figure every single day to the same music, which is John Martin's Solid Air. Very quickly discovered that the drawings looked boring, you know, just one figure didn't sort of kind of fit onto just an upright figure, didn't really fit onto the page. So I swiped my hand across it. And in that moment, something was born. And what was born is this series called Blown Away. And people tend to think these sculptures are about standing in the wind, but they're also about feeling blown away, sometimes in a slightly more difficult way. You know, where on the outside, you're looking like you're upright and you're fine, but on the inside, you're actually feeling quite, you know, you're only just keeping your balance. And I'm very happy for people to interpret these sculptures either way, either kind of joyously, as you're standing in the elements, or perhaps more psychologically, And I have, bizarrely, I've sold, so this is a sort of series of works, and I have sold quite a few of these to people who've been suffering from the loss of a loved one, and they've spoken to them. So I didn't make it in that context, but I always love it when somebody really sort of brings something to my own sculptures. They bring their emotions to my work. So the next slide, yes, now this was lovely. This was in Bath. And this, I've never done anything like this before, but you can barely see it, which is part of the point. But this was wonderful because I had the opportunity to use the bits of a Victorian bridge that were being dismantled to make a sculpture on the blown away theme. So that is all very old cast iron that was sort of blasted off and then we repainted. Very much not like my normal work, but what you can't see behind me, behind those people, so to speak, is this is a very contemporary new set of buildings. So somehow we were trying to join the old through the metal and the very contemporary, the very new. And that, again, that's one of those themes which I mention now because we'll come back to that in relation to ship. So if we have the next photo, please. And while we're waiting for the next photo, one of the beauties of this was working with the craftspeople. Now I'm going to show you this video. I don't know, Susanna, are you registering this as a video? And if so, could you possibly press play? Here we should be going now. So this is kind of the reality of my studio. This is, as you can see, this is a wax piece that's a recent commission. You can see it's all having to be propped up. I've sprayed the wax white so that I can start to see it. And I'm just showing this because there's a bit of a juxtaposition between the sort of, and you can also vaguely see my studio. But there we go. Can you see how propped up it is? Yes. And talking of the conversation of birds we had earlier, 2 peacocks came to my door this morning. So that was a bit of a thrill. I know they're not natural birds like you're talking about. Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll move to the next slide now, Susanna. And that's the video again, which we probably need to switch on to the next slide. But there we go. That's the one I wanted. Thank you. So there we go. This is a photoshopped version. So that is what you've just seen in the studio. That's what it's going to look like when it's in bronze. And you'll remember the piece at Chelsea that I showed you, which was the first blown away one I showed you. And I don't know if you could see, but over time sculptures develop. So I would say that in this one, the cloth is sort of, it's more flowing. It feels more like it's in the wind. Her hands are more open, giving her a sense perhaps I think this is appreciation and joy in the elements. So this is again how sometimes sculptors appear to make the same thing, and they are, but if you do that on repeat, sometimes you come across new themes, and the sculptures slowly develop. So we'll go for the next slide now. Okay, I just wanted to show you this because this is another piece of fun. So this chap called Richard Chappell, who's a choreographer and dancer, approached me a few years ago. And we started working together. This is the two, sort of the left and the top photos are him just playing in the studio with sculptures I had, which was just a fascinating process. And down at the bottom, you can see me actually taking a cast using alginate off his face, which is always an interesting experience for the person having it done. But if we can have the next slide. One of the reasons I wanted to show you this work with Richard Chappell, well, actually, there's several reasons, but one of them is that it provoked me to make some very light work, some very lightweight work. And I was already interested in the theme of hollowness, but working with these dancers really made me develop that aspect of the work and think about the emotional aspect of a work that is hollow. And I can't help it. I'm just going to say, so down at the bottom left-hand corner, that's actually sort of me at the Royal Opera House behind the scenes where we got to perform on one of their many stages. So it's also, I mean, as a sculptor, you're often in the studio alone. So when an opportunity like this comes up to work with people, or indeed to work with an organisation like Morecambe Bay Partnership, it's always a great privilege. Right, we'll have the next slide, please. And part of the collaboration with Richard Chappell Dance was I then got to make a very, very long drawing and show the hollow sculptures, and we actually had the dancers dancing in the gallery, which was fab. Although this particular exhibition is very poignant to me because this was the first time in which I actually had to elbow bump somebody. So this was literally a year ago I did this, when before any of us knew what was going to come to us, really. We were just getting the first inklings. So, and the performance, the actual performance in the theatre was cancelled. So anyway, we've all had a very difficult year. So this one, again, that's one of the dance pieces and just looking at hollowness. But I think we won't dwell long on that one because there's a lot of slides to get through. Okay. So maybe 5 years ago, I took on a new studio and sort of said to myself, right, I'm going to make new work. It might be more than 5 years. This piece was made at a time when, do you remember those images of refugees on our television screens? There was a time when there were people walking across Europe. And it was this, so this piece is called What It Takes. And it was a twofold question, really. What does it take to leave your home and your family? How desperate must you be? And I read Anne Frank's diary as a child, and, they didn't in some ways leave their country, and, well, I mean, tragedy. So asking that question, but also asking, when you see a stream of refugees, asking myself the question, what does it take to recognize somebody as an individual when you see them in a mass? So it was really this piece is trying to get down to the minimum. And we'll look at the next slide now. By the way, shoes are very important to me. So this is, again, it's a similar piece. This was a newspaper photo of some Syrian refugees waiting on a train platform. The reason it's on a pallet is it just felt like humans moving around the world, like we ship goods around the world. At this point, I was focusing less on the environmental crisis and more on the human crisis. But somehow in my mind, there's a sort of a connection, the globalization that in some ways we enjoy, you could say, also leads to these problems, which is refugees and the environmental crisis. But I'm hoping here that you're beginning to see maybe echoes of some elements of ship, mainly in the hollowness and maybe in my interest in the way people move around the planet. So we'll go for the next sculpture. The next slide. And the next slide was a piece I did up in Liverpool for the... So this piece I wanted to show you because I was invited by Castle Fine Arts Foundry, who are based in Liverpool and who actually cast ship. I was invited to show a piece on this plinth in the inner city. And these figures, in a way, in my mind, are as if those refugees have sort of sat down. One of the reasons this piece is important to me is because I do believe it was one of the pieces that maybe some people in Morecambe Bay Partnership had seen, and the lovely art advisor, Claire Mander from the CoLab, who was advising Morecambe Bay. I think people saw this piece and they realised that I had a connection with Liverpool, which is, of course, so near to you in Morecambe. And so that's why I particularly remain fond of this piece. And the other funny thing, which I'll say just while Susanna's finding the next slide, please, Susanna, but the lovely thing about this is the teenagers didn't destroy it. What they did do is they sat on it and took social media pictures of themselves cuddling it, which was lovely. So now we've got a set of slides now, which I want to talk about my relationship to the sea. So my father always played around in boats, and it feels like part of my heritage. I have done some sailing. And this piece, I was lucky enough to be invited to Alderney to make this piece, partly to celebrate the Alderney Music Festival. And I just turned up on the island and they said, make something, what can you find? And I found these cable drums in an old fort. But I'm afraid what you can't see in this photograph is that those cable drums are sitting on an old bomb shelter, lookout post, right on the beach. And I really loved the idea of taking a Second World War concrete structure and turning it into an art plinth. But here is, again, here's someone looking out to sea. So this is, as you will recognise, one of the themes that I have kind of worked on, and that I wasn't conscious of it when I came up with the idea of ship. I think all these ideas are in one's psyche. So if we could have the next slide, please. There we go. And that piece, I also make series of very small pieces in wax, which are then burnt out using the lost wax method. But that wheel was also found in the harbour at Alderney. I think it might be some sort of steamroller. But the rust is important to me, and the fact that the sculptures are rusty. I suppose for me, it's a sense of the past, and it also takes them away from the figures, away from being too smooth and perfect, and blends them with their environment, which in this case, their environment has become the found object, as we call it in the art world. So we'll have the next slide, which again, well, my sister and I just about managed to haul this out of the mud of an estuary. Again, a figure perched. I just can't help myself. I keep coming back to that. And we'll go for the next slide. This again, a rusty bronze figure. This is called Watching It Happen, and it's about sea level rise. And although you can't see the sea in it, that is a sea defence, a groin sea defence. And I think at that point I felt that I'd rather left some of my earlier environmental commitments behind, and I was just aware of the disaster unfolding, and yet in a way detached, doing my sculpture and looking at it. So that's, for me, that's quite a personal sculpture. I also had to bribe my children and their friends with ice creams to try and get them to lift that into the car for me. Yes, behind the sculpture there's motherhood still at work. Right, if we'd have the next one. And this is also from the sea. This is a piece of sea defence from Torcross in Devon, where many of you might know there was a horrendous disaster in the Second World War, where a lot of Canadians were killed by an unexpected U-boat when they were practicing for the landings. So this piece is called Rescue Me, and really it's a tribute to the men who died in that particular place. Right, we'll do the next slide. Right, here we are. We're in Heysham. So I turned up in Heysham on the invite of Morecambe Bay Partnership, along with lots of other artists. And I tell you, it did not look like this. It was the most amazing. You know, one of those days when it's absolutely grey and the sea has got these white sort of caps on it. And we'll have the next photo while I'm talking, please, Susanna. And I went down into St. Peter's Church. So forgive me, anyone who doesn't come from Morecambe Bay and doesn't know what I mean, but it's a tiny, beautiful little church. And as I was looking across the sea, grey, stormy, with that lovely white seagulls and, you know, white, this rainbow came and just hit the sea as close as a rainbow will ever hit a sea in front of you. And I just thought of my dad. Now, there's someone on this talk who will know my father very well, but she knows who she is. And the point is that my father, I knew I was coming to look at a commission about St. Patrick, to celebrate that amongst other aspects of the bay, the arrival of St. Patrick. And my father came from Ireland. And I'd also, the year before, been lucky enough to go to Iceland. So I was really tuned in to this sense of people throughout the ages traveling across the seas, you know, that, you know, we think travel is a modern thing, but actually these seas were plied by people, by boats, by the Vikings, you know, by the early Christians, etc. And one of the other beautiful things about this place, about Heysham Head and then moving on to Half Moon Bay, which is just a little bit further down the coast, is that what I love is you can still see the ferry coming in from the Isle of Man. And so there's this tradition which lasts to this day. And if we have the next slide, please, Susanna. This is the stone in the church. This is a hogback stone in that little church I just told you about, St. Peter's. So the whole place is sort of steeped in history. So so we had this day when we were shown around, and I just got on the train back home to the south, and I was so inspired. So we'll have the next slide, please. And I just knew, it's just the idea came to me instantly. Pretty much. I mean, this isn't the drawing that I drew on the train in my tiny sketch pad. This is slightly more developed. But when you get to Half Moon Bay, for those people who don't know it, it's quite extraordinary because, and we'll get to this later with some slides. On one side, you can look out to the docks and the very modern, you know, docks and lights, and on the other, you're looking at nature. So I really had this sense of wanting to recognise those two bits, and also the past and the present. But we'll come back to that. So if we go for the next slide. There we go. So I very hastily, in my excitement, put together this maquette. Maquette being a small model that a sculptor will make, and gingerly took it up to the interview in Morecambe Bay, which is at that rather stunning hotel you've got. I've forgotten what it's called. And I'm so glad I made this maquette, because even though obviously the final piece doesn't look like this, I think it did give everyone an idea of what we could do. This would have been far too complex to make, and possibly even dangerous for children. I could just see them climbing on it and falling, and you have to start putting your artistic vision into something more practical and worrying about things like what will happen when children climb on it. So we'll go for the next slide now. And then that summer, in fact, I've slightly lost track of time, but we were discussing, I was very lucky and got to Norway and saw these absolutely exquisite ships and just felt even more inspired. And I know that in Morecambe you have a Viking festival. So I just felt doubly, you know, hopeful that my idea would come to fruition. So we'll go for the next slide now. And then, of course, you have to start getting technical about this. And we'll have the next slide. This is a computer graphic by Castle Fine Art Foundry, which just looks ghastly, doesn't it? But I mean, there's so much skill goes into something like that. And although and this is a good point to mention, that although I am the sculptor and all of that, oh my goodness, is this a team effort? And the amount of different people who've injected their skills into this is quite phenomenal. So we'll go for the next slide now. Okay, so here we are on my left in my old studio, a bit smaller than you can see in my new studio. And what I'm doing is, again, I'm using masking tape, because there wasn't actually enough money in the budget to do what one would traditionally do, which is to make a mould of some sculptures and then cast into bronze. So what we decided to do was to cast directly. That means there's no mould. We're just going to melt the wax out in that ancient lost wax process. All those little rusty figures I showed you, that's how they're done. So I had a lot of experience, but never had I done it on this scale, and neither had the foundry. So it was quite nerve-wracking. And there on the right, you see them set up in the foundry where I worked on them. And I wanted them set up as they would be so that I could really see how it would work. We go to the next slide now. There we go. So we made the figures in wax, covering as, can you see the packing tape on the leg of the figure on the left? That's what I would call a release agent. Hope some of you will enjoy this technical stuff and some of you won't. So bear with me if you would. We covered the masking tape with packing tape. We put 5mm of wax on, and then we cut the wax off. Here on the right is the lovely Ben Broadbent, who's a sculptor in his own right, works at the foundry, and he assisted me, which was invaluable. And then we're putting all the pieces back together, so we end up with this hollow structure. If we could possibly have the next slide now. And then this is what it looks like. This is what bronze looks like when it comes back from the casting process. On the left, you'll see a figure in what's described as a cage, but can you see all the other metal structures? They're called the runners and risers, because what happens is as you have to pour bronze into the hollow shape that's left by the ceramic shell. It is quite technical. And then you have to make sure the air escapes. But this method is ancient. I mean, the Benin people were casting bronzes, I think 4,000 years ago in Africa, and obviously the Greeks. There are the two heads and all the legs again, all the bits. it always feels like a disaster at this stage, but they are so skilled at the foundry that they just fix it all back together. So we'll have the next slide, and there they are. The pieces are fixed back together. And now the pieces, this is now, we're in Liverpool now. And yes, and this is where reality starts. You know, the drawings start to actually become structures, and, you know, you just, quite a nervous moment when they first go on. But as you can see, we're testing it and it all worked. So next slide. And again, most of you visited probably haven't thought of this, but we had to do quite a lot of groundwork just to stabilize the ground, obviously. Again, it just brings back this thing that it's such a teamwork effort. And what I want to say at this point is, I don't know if you can see that little building, the little white building in the background. That is the Half Moon Bay Cafe. And just a little bit of a shout out for that. If any of you ever visit, wonderful bacon sandwiches, kept us all warm with their tea and sandwiches. So it's well worth a visit. And next slide. Okay, and this is the opening. This is the opening day, which was such a joyous occasion. I felt so welcomed, and it's very nerve-wracking when you put a sculpture up. You know, not every public sculpture is well received, and you can get it wrong. But in the process of putting it up, it was lovely because various people walked their dogs, and I could begin to feel that it was going to be okay. And sometimes I just went back in the few days between setting it up and the actual, I went back anonymously to listen to what people said. And there's one man who came along and he tapped it and he said, "Aye, better than nout," which I thought was lovely. Anyway, we've gone to the next slide, but here is an opportunity. If we just stay on this slide, there's some important people here to thank. So Jan Shorrock of Morecambe Bay Partnership. Yes, this lady here on the right, my goodness, she saw me through this. Then you've got Susanna, who is just inspirational, and you all know Susanna, I think. There at the back, we've got Claire Mander. Now, Claire Mander is from the CoLab art consultancy, and she was fabulous too. She was really good to ask questions when we developed the sculpture around some of the more theoretical aspects, and yeah, she was an ongoing support. And then we've got Eleanor and Lauren from Deco Publique, who did all the publicity, and again, towers of strength. And then yours truly. So again, team effort, and that's just some of the team. Good. So we'll go to the next photo now. What a blissful day. No COVID. Just makes you sad. Well, it makes me sad looking at that. But it was, sorry, only because of COVID. But what a wonderful day. What a wonderful celebration. And so we'll go to the next slide. Now, at this point, I'd just like to thank Robin Zala, who took some of these images. There's another photographer I'll thank later, so don't worry, Keith. But Robin Zala took some of these, what I would call formal images. And it's also a moment to just mention that actually the land belongs to Lancaster City Council. So, you know, shout out to them as well, because without them, this wouldn't have happened. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier. For those of you who don't know Half Moon Bay, this is what you see on one side. This is industry. It's the modern world. And if we go to the next slide, the other figure, actually that is the same figure, but looking at the same, it's difficult to explain, but one looks across the bay, which is effectively timeless. So there's this sort of sense of trying to connect the land and the sea, the past and the present. And one of the most common questions that comes up is, why are the figures hollow? And you, having now seen my previous work, you'll see what I was trying to aim for. I was trying to get away from the false idea of I know a lot of the sculptures I made appeared to be solid but were hollow. So I was trying to get rid of that. That's kind of formal question. But I wanted to be able to see through the sculptures to the land. I wanted them to be like the ship, something that you could see through. And for me, that's trying to integrate the sculpture with the landscape, just like the sculpture is trying to integrate the past and the present. And had these figures been sort of complete figures, so to speak, they would, I think, perhaps more be seen as historical characters or as contemporary characters. I was trying to break the boundary between the body and the land. So I think we've got one more slide, is that right? Oh yes, so at this point I will mention Keith Stanley, who you can find on Instagram as Keith Two Sheds. Have I got that right, Keith? You can correct me later. And I met him when he's a local man who is a superb photographer. And I met him when I installed it. And he's been my connection to this sculpture in a way, because every now and then he sends me an image, which I so appreciate, because he watches it in different weathers. I've seen it in snow, I've seen it in sun, I've seen mist. Susanna also keeps me in touch, but Keith sends me these wonderful images. So I now really do think we're on to the last slide now. Okay, so this here, Keith Two Sheds, there's his handle on Instagram. Oh, and he sent me this summer, and I was so delighted because I'd been getting feedback that actually the community did like the sculpture, which I can't tell you how touched I am by that, how important that is to me. Crucial. But there's something about it becoming part of the landscape, becoming part of Half Moon Bay. And when I was working on this project, I came and went from Morecambe quite a lot. I don't know how trips up the M6 I did, but and on the train, and I was lucky enough to stay at the Royal at Heysham. And there's photos there of the 1950s and I think even earlier photos I saw when I was doing my research, when in fact people would come to Morecambe and they'd come to Half Moon Bay. I think there was a fun fair here, someone said. And then bizarrely, this last summer in lockdown, Keith sent me this photo, and it felt like, well, this is extraordinary. It's almost like the fact that none of us can go abroad has almost re-enlivened Half Moon Bay. There's much more, almost like the old days. It had come back to the past. And I think I'll end on that note, just because I'd love to hear any questions you all have. But Tom, who's sort of chairing the meeting, I just wondered if you had felt any similar feelings this summer about what had happened to Half Moon Bay during COVID, and how the sculpture had related to the community and stuff like that. I wonder if you had any sort of feedback on that.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, we'll probably widen that question out actually for people to share their memories. I think what was really striking, I mean, you mentioned the 1950s and also the pleasure ground, which was called Heysham Head. And one of my favourite stories is apparently it's where Pinky and Perky came from. It's like where they made their debut, I think, was the Heysham Head pleasure attraction. But yeah, it was the coming of the sort of cheap package holiday, I think, that partly did for Half Moon Bay and people going abroad. And of course, what happened this year when the international borders were closed was everyone rediscovered their local places, their local green space, what we call blue space. So, every lake and swimmable river and bit of coastline, people were rediscovering. And I think that was really, really powerful, the way that people rediscovered their local place and rediscovered that sense of heritage. And I think what I love about SHIP is actually the transparency of it. I think is really, really important, because, like, just as you said, the sculpture is around kind of the connection between people and landscape. That is exactly what people were doing at SHIP in the last 12 months, was reconnecting with local landscape rather than going off sort of to other places. So that photo from Keith Two Sheds, I think, perfectly captures that. So yeah, I don't know if anybody, I'm going to break the way we manage these talks now, but Claire is kind of in charge of the mute, but you are able, I think, to take yourself off mute as well, aren't you? So if anyone would like to raise any memories of Heysham, or thoughts particularly about the sculpture, or your own experiences of it over the last year, I think please share them. The questions, Anna, I have to say, are pouring in now that you've finished. But if anyone would just like to start off with some memories before we go to the formal questions, it would be lovely to hear from you. Yeah, I think it's appropriate we start with two sheds, Jackson. It's just,
I've only got one shed, by the way. Just saying that photographing ship over the last 12 months and see how it changes with the weather, with almost everything. It's amazing. It's almost like it's alive. It's different every time you see it, and it's a great inspiration if you want to go down onto the bay and just sit and be. Everything every day is different. And thank you, Anna, for putting that sculpture there. It means an awful lot to the people.
Thank you. Thank you too for your keeping me connected.
I'll try and keep doing that. Thank you.
It feels a bit cruel sometimes to pick on people. The other person who I know is brilliant at sharing memories when we do these evenings is Gail. I remember you did it at Christmas, Gail, as well. Do you have any memories you'd be happy to share?
Well, I just put a couple in. Can you hear me?
Yeah, great, really well.
Okay, I just put a couple in. I said the first ever picnic I had was at Half Moon Bay. My grandmother was a seaside landlady in Morecambe, so she mustn't have been so busy in the season. It was before the season. We went on the bus from the west end of Morecambe to Heysham, the village and the roundabout, and then we walked over to Half Moon Bay, and I had my first ever picnic there when I was about 5 or 6, played with the bucket and spade, and as I said, part of the little dessert was this homemade cherry pie. And I also remember Heysham Head, and it was absolutely magical. The swing boats and everything, the rose garden, such a treat to go there. And my auntie had a caravan at Ocean Edge, and it was actually a homemade caravan. They had one on the edge of the sea. And my uncle had he was an engineer, and made this caravan. So I used to go and stay, and then sometimes go to Heysham Head with my Auntie Emily. So it's a magical place.
Thank you, Gail. I mean, I know I think I have heard stories before about sort of the closure of Heysham Head as an attraction, and also there was a big there was the go-kart site as well, wasn't there? The racetrack, and actually, in some ways, the history of this area has been of things being taken away, and actually a landscape that's slowly emptying, and actually to have ship back as a real commitment to the place and the people of actually really putting something very positive back into this slightly empty space. I think that's been quite symbolically powerful. I have heard people say that. So thank you. Shall we I'll see if I can sort through some of the questions then, if that's okay. So Susanna, I'm going to start with yours, which I think is just feeds on so brilliantly from what we've just been talking about and heard from. So Anna, you touched on the community response and the importance of it for you, and you kind of hinted at the fact that maybe some of your installations maybe occasionally they don't land as well. There's a big discussion, isn't there, at the moment about an Andy Goldsworthy sculpture on a beach. But so how special is it to you to hear and feel the warmth of the response to this particular sculpture?
I mean, that's it. That's the purpose of the process of making it and working with people. Morecambe Bay Partnership, Jan in particular, I have very, very close working with Claire, obviously Suzanne. That's wonderful. But the ongoing thing, I've been surprised because I actually haven't made very many permanent artworks like this. Normally I work in a gallery. And the installations I've done are much more temporary. I think the one on the beach, I'm going to forget her name now. Anyway, we don't need to mention other names. It is hard to get it right. But the guy who said, it's It's difficult. I wanted this piece to work on lots of different levels. And I think one of the joys of being a figurative sculptor is that it means I wanted people to be able to understand the work on lots of different levels, and including people who don't have experience of the art world. There's lots of wonderful sculptures out there, but that possibly only accessible to people who understand some of the theory behind it. But this, Susanna was very clear. What you've just said about, things being taken away from Morecambe and Half Moon Bay, and in some ways, Half Moon Bay, I don't mean to be rude because it's one of the most beautiful places I've been, but there is a sense in which it hasn't been invested in, little things like the concrete cracked and whatever, and it's so beautiful. It deserves to really be seen for its beauty. And bizarrely, I think putting the sculpture there, it's very difficult to speak about this because I don't want to put, but I hope that local people felt like that their community was actually valued. Let's put something beautiful here to celebrate how beautiful this place is. And as far as I'm aware, that worked, and most people have really appreciated it. And it means the world. I would have been devastated if lots of people would have hated it. I would have gone up with an ankle crunch. Oh gosh, awful.
Yeah,
anyway, it wasn't awful. It was lovely.
Thank you.
Susanna, wasn't there also that wonderful comment from the little girl? Could you say it better than I do? Because again, this is on the theme of the unexpected. Susanna, what was it?
A small girl, a memory was sent in, but to Anna, and it was of a visit to Ship soon after the sculpture had been unveiled, and it was reported to us by her mother, and it was reported to us as follows: that the little girl said, "I love that. And yet it's sad, and yet it's happy, and the holes in the people. Mummy, that's their homesick feeling. They are looking out for their mummies across the sea."
Remember that.
I was so moved by that. And do you remember what I said earlier in the talk about when I turned up on that first day and was standing in St. Peter's churchyard and just this rainbow struck and I felt like my dad was there? I think although it was a public sculpture and I was looking at, about Morecambe Bay and the land and all these forms, I think there was a little bit of me that sculpture, and I hope nobody minds because I hope people connect to it in their own ways. There's a tiny bit in there of my father, of that missing him, and of that sense of longing that you get when you look out across the sea for people who you can no longer connect to. So I was entranced that that little girl put it so well.
Thank you. Loads of other comments. I'm not going to read them all out, but people sharing just wonderful sort of memories and thoughts about their own responses to the piece from either seeing it every day or seeing it for the first time. So we will have to make sure we save them all for you. I'm going to go back to some questions though. I hope that's okay. So this is quite a simple one. So Pat asks, where is or was the sculpture called Watching It Happen, please?
It's with a collector. Somebody bought it from a gallery.
Okay.
And that just that's a very interesting difference. I mean, obviously I'm extremely grateful for the sales I make through the traditional gallery I'm with, because they help me keep going. But there is a way that when you sell a sculpture through a gallery, it disappears. I don't even know the name of the person who's got that sculpture. So the joy of something like Ship is that it doesn't disappear. It doesn't disappear into somebody's individual home where nobody ever sees it again. And I don't even know if they bought it. I didn't even get to hear them say, "Oh, that's fun," or "I like that," or "It reminds," all of this stuff that we're doing now.
Yeah.
If you sell a sculpture commercially, you don't get this experience of connection to people. You get money, which is very nice, but not connection. It's more important.
So another question here. I think a couple of other people have sort of hinted at it, but not really asked it as a question. So Michelle asks, I'm interested to know how important the faces of the figures are to the piece. The faces on ships stay with me even when I'm not looking at a photo. Are they based on anyone?
They are, but I'm not going to say who. So no, basically I'd kept a photograph for a long time of a male head that I just saw in a Sunday Times magazine, or Sunday magazine, and I'd cut it out, and it was a classic. I just was entranced by it. I was also entranced because they had their hair very cropped, and I love cropped hair because then you can really see the skull. And I think when I was modelling the faces, basically I was using that. And both faces are very similar, and that's deliberate, because a bit like, do you remember that sculpture I showed you right at the beginning of the child and the adult figure in bandages? It's like these two people, these two men aren't separate. They're the same in a way. They're the same person. They're just past and present. So the fact that they're very similar was part of my idea.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got Louise. So there's a bit of preamble and then the question. So she's really interested to hear what you said about other people putting their interpretations on your own work. I always wondered how close a piece of sculpture is to the artist, as it's your hands that make it. Yet, of course, it's a commission for another purpose. I mean, I think you've just talked about this really articulately. So is there an active process of letting go of your work when you release it out there into the world?
Yeah, but less so in something like this where I knew it was going to be there. But when I sell something, sometimes it's really difficult. What I found, which is interesting, is sometimes the closer I make it to my own personal experience, this is weird, but the more likely other people are to relate to it. More likely it is to sort of hit some kind of archetypal theme which everyone can relate to. So if you work very personally, is it okay to let go of it? Occasionally it's a bit odd if somebody makes a sort of comment that is, but mostly people don't. Mostly people come up with this kind of stuff we're talking about. Memory, sadness, all sorts of different things. And it's almost what it's about. If people start doing this, then the sculpture has succeeded. When they take it on for themselves. But that doesn't, actually, I can answer that question. In a way, I don't have to let go of it. I don't have to let go of my meaning. They can just add theirs. It's all good.
Yeah, it's nice, isn't it? It's sort of, you don't lose anything from a sculpture like this. You still got your own relationship to it, but then everyone else's response to it just adds, doesn't it? It just kind of makes it kind of bigger and more special. And yeah.
There's no limit. We can be generous with the feelings, you know.
Yeah. Probably quite a good link. So I mentioned this at the beginning. Obviously, thank you everyone for coming along. And if you are enjoying this and the opportunity to speak to Anna and ask questions, then please do think about giving to Morecambe Bay Partnership. It really does help us to keep this both this talk series going, but also it helps us to build new projects that can bring other sort of, whether it's artworks or access or oral history projects to the people of the Bay. So the link is in the chat function. Thank you very much for all those of you who have given, and we do really appreciate it, and it does really help. A couple of other questions have come in. This one I was going to ask, actually, so I'm glad that Keith has. He's asked about season 3 of the ITV drama The Bay. So obviously the installation has overlapped very neatly with what's become quite a big success for ITV, and it's not always necessarily the sides of living here that we'd want to celebrate. I appreciate that, but it still brings attention. So can we confirm that ship is going to be used in the opening credits of series 3 of The Bay?
Well, yes, they very kindly asked permission for that to happen. And And Susanna and I sort of said yes with delight, because I think it signifies that it does sort of, I mean, the word icon seems very, well, I'm extremely flattered. So that seems a bit over the top, but they're saying that it's an important symbol. And so I'm delighted.
Yeah.
As I hope they don't sort of fake some murder there and give it a spin vibe. That's my only, I suddenly thought, oh, I don't want them to give it a meaning that is negative when all of us are enjoying this. But anyway, whatever. Again, it's out of our hands as to what they do. Yeah. It's fine.
Well, I'm interested that you come from Bath, because of course if this was Midsummer Murders, it would actually probably be the murder weapon. Yes. They'd find some way of shoehorning that into the plot, wouldn't they? I think it's slightly different.
So I've got a bit of a funny story. So when I was up at Morecambe a lot during this process, I met all sorts of people. I had a wonderful time. And people would say, well, where are you from? And I'd say, from Bath. And they'd look at me like I was mad. And after a while I learned, and I'd say, oh, I'm from Bath. And they go, oh, yeah. So I had to change how I spoke.
Oh, very good. Yeah, it's the flat Viking vowels, I think. That's what does it. Great. So yeah, loads and loads of comments here about again just saying thank you, and saying thank you to Morecambe Bay Partnership actually as well for the whole series. And this is a nice comment from Fiona. Thank you very much for a fab series. So this goes out to Susanna, I think, and the team, and sees this very much as a grand finale. So I think probably this is more like the big climax at the end of Act 1, I think, before the intermission, and then we have an intermission, and then we'll come back with some more fab talks afterwards. But it's great that people are seeing this as a bit of a climax. So thank you. Couple more here. Yeah, this is a really good question actually from Pat, and I think it comes through particularly when you see the sort of the totality of all your work. And I loved what you said about the way that it all links together and builds. But some of it is very theatrical, isn't it? There's a lot of movement in your work. So Pat asks, is there any chance of you doing any more theatrical type work?
Well, by which does she mean work with the dancers?
I'm imagining that's probably what she's referring to specifically. Yeah.
I hope we have something planned in Exeter this summer. But honestly, I mean, for performing arts, as we all know, it's been such a disastrous year.
Yeah.
It's been much easier being a visual artist. But yeah, no, I'm very keen to do more collaborations. If you're asking, if the woman who's just asked if she's interested, it's Pat. I think it's fab working with performing artists. And was really astounded to find out how you think completely opposite. A choreographer and a sculptor, one deals with movement, one deals with static objects. But we had an extraordinary amount in common and understood each other's professions in a way that quite shocked us. So yes, I hope to do more work in performance. Yeah.
And it's funny you should mention the dancing, because I think that was one of the other, I know it was a very temporary installation, but that got a really big response from Headlands to Headspace, was the dance performance on the lots. So I appreciate at Silverdale, I appreciate it's a bit further north, but it's that same wonderful backdrop. That was another thing that Morecambe Bay Partnership worked on that went down very well.
Bob Mulholland's fantastic sculptures with the mirrored figures.
That was beautiful. That was at Heysham as well. Yeah.
Which really mirrored, as my piece, you kind of hope to see through to the landscape. What he did is, by using these mirrored figures, he was literally mirroring the beauty. That was wonderful as well.
I remember the launch evening we did for that, and it was the most beautiful sunset. And you couldn't really tell the difference between where the sky was ending and the sea was beginning, and the sculptures were. It is beautiful, and there is something, isn't there, about the quality of the light. I know like you mentioned Tate St. Ives earlier on, and I know one of the things that it's probably a bit of a cliche, but was the quality of the light down at St. Ives was what attracted, obviously Barbara Hepworth and others down there. And there is something about the light on the bay, isn't there, that must be amazing for you as an artist to work with.
And the constant change, as was it Keith saying, constant, extraordinary place.
Yeah,
right, extraordinary.
So another one. So a question about the stone. At first, it seemed too much of a contrast to apart from the sculpture, but now I see it as an anchor, and it pins the ship to the land and adds a sense of permanence. This is Catherine writing this. Thank you for giving us the ship. It feels like a part that was missing.
Oh, fantastic. Can I say something about the stone? Because I suppose one of the things that convinced, I wanted it, and part of the brief was that it was to be a place of reflection. The sculpture was to be somewhere where people could go and reflect. And I did feel that people needed to be able to physically rest in order to do that. And I was terribly keen, you know, I didn't want this to become, the whole sculpture to become a glorified bench. You know, there's a lot of bench sculptures out there. But when I went to that museum in Norway, those, and in fact, I think I showed you one of the photos, the boats almost have this central key to them, which is kind of where the mast comes out. It's almost like the strongest point of the boat. So I was partly seeing the stone as that. It's the most local stone we could get as the crow flies. But I also, do you remember the first maquette I made with the sort of complicated ribs? I had this vision that I wanted children to be able to fantasize it was a ship, and that somehow having the stone in the middle, I wanted them to be able to stand on the stone and somehow be in or on a ship. That was one thing. And then the other thing is I actually wanted maybe people who were less firm to be able to rest there. So that's what the stone is doing. I'm hoping it's integrating nicely. I mean, is it changing colour? Is the grass growing a little bit around it? Is it coming in nicely to become part of the piece? Is that a yes? Susanna's not. I don't know. Anyway, so yes, we did think a lot. I mean, every aspect of that sculpture, we thought a lot, including the stone. Yeah.
That was good, and that was the bit. Catherine's just pointed out that she forgot to actually ask her question as she got carried away with the with all her writing. But yeah, she was asking what the original intention was of the stone, which is absolutely what you've just answered. So thank you. So I mean, a couple more comments I'll just read out. Constant change is a perfect description of the bay. Thank you for giving us the ship. It's just perfect for the space. Another one actually here from Jane, which is lovely. I've been there today. My friend said the visits to the overall area have kept her sane in the last year. Those of you who know the bay will know about that very strong link with well-being. I think it goes right back to Morecambe as a sort of Victorian tourist destination as well, where people came to take the air and the sea air, and you know, the way that Morecambe in particular was designed as almost like a sort of wilder, more natural alternative to Blackpool. And I know that even further back, I mean, when you go to Heysham, particularly if you enter from the village side, from the St. Peter's Church side, that whole vista of getting the view has been stage managed since Saxon times. So the chapel there, St. Patrick's Chapel, the way you go up there originally was from the church up those amazing little winding stone staircase, and the whole point was that for many people it was their first time of ever seeing the bay, in some cases ever seeing the sea. So the first thing you did was you came up from the church, up the steps, and then suddenly there was the chapel and there was the archway that was on your very first sort of slide when you were talking about ship. And then suddenly that view, and you can imagine how that would have been more than just a sort of a healthy experience. It would have been a transcendental experience, like a kind of religious experience. And that was deliberately stage managed by the monks who ran the chapel. And then as early as in kind of Georgian times, again, you know, the cobbles and those big high walls that take you down from the village up onto Heysham Barrows. It was the same thing. It was deliberately stage managed because it was a place of pilgrimage and early tourism, and people were visiting to get the air and the views, but people were also getting this very emotional experience, because there was that amazing wow factor of seeing the sea and the ruins for the very first time. And I think your ship is definitely linked into that same history of kind of, you know, stage managing these kind of wow moments with the view. That, as I say, they that way of doing these literally goes back 1500 years. I think the monks realized they got more donations when they stage managed it more. Apparently that's, you know, that's true when you look at some of the church records and things. Good. So I think that's all the questions we've had on the chat. Can I ask one, because no one else has asked this? So I do apologize if anyone doesn't like the techie questions, but it was just about the process. You mentioned a few times about the lost wax method, and I wondered if you could say maybe just a tiny bit about what the lost wax method actually is, because I'd kind of assumed it meant the wax was inside the masking tape, but then you alluded to the fact that you put the wax over the top of the masking tape. So I'm a bit confused. How does it work?
Well, the lost wax method, basically, if you make a sculpture in wax and then you cover it with what we now use is ceramic shell, but something that isn't going to burn. The old days it was sort of plaster and crushed fire brick. And you'd make a hole in the bottom and a hole in the top. You put that wax object covered with sort of fireproof material in a kiln, and the wax literally melts out. The wax is lost. In fact, we collect it and use it again. But anyway, it's lost wax. And then what you've got inside that shell is the exact shape you want to create in bronze. So then you pour the bronze in and it cools, and once it's cooled, you break off that external shell of fireproof plaster, brick, ceramic shell, and you've got in bronze the exact shape that you did have in the wax. So that's the sort of fundamental principle behind the lost wax technique. What I did is I created all those wax sections by putting them on top of the masking tape. And then I cut them off the masking tape and reassembled them, so we had a hollow figure.
Yeah. Okay.
Because the thing about bronze is people always talk about, oh, solid bronze. Bronze is never solid. If bronze is more than 5 millimeter thick, you get appalling shrinkage and it cracks.
Mm.
So every sculpture you see in Lancashire town, you know, whatever, it's not solid if it's bronze. It's about 5 mil thick.
Thank you. Thank you. No, it's just interesting to get that sense of 3 dimensions. I love the fact that it was sort of built in sections as well. There's something kind of like armor, isn't there, when you see it like that? That felt like it linked very nicely to the Viking origins of the story. So thank you. I know we always show our appreciation in the usual way with a big round of applause. So I hopefully you'll see some of us. And there's obviously a function as well where you can do hand clapping on your Zoom. But massive thank you. It's been a wonderful evening. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Morecambe Bay Partnership, for inviting me to make the sculpture in the first place. Thank you.